What would you do if the very people who promised to uphold your community's values turned against you? If your own neighbors saw you not as a person but as a problem that needed to be removed? For Daniel, Dan Reynolds, a decorated veteran who had already given more to his country than most ever would, the fight for his own home became a battle he never expected to face. Dan had served with honor, surviving 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan. He had led men through firefights, carried wounded brothers in arms to safety, and suffered wounds that would follow him for the rest of his life. The last mission had cost him his left leg below the knee, but even as he adjusted to life with a prosthetic, he never once questioned whether his sacrifice had been worth it. He believed in the American dream: work hard, serve honorably, and in return, find a place to call home. That dream led him to Whispering Pines, a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood where the lawns were neatly trimmed, the flags waved proudly on front porches, and the quiet streets promised the kind of peace he desperately needed. The house was perfect, single-story, easy to navigate with his prosthetic, and close enough to the VA hospital for his medical appointments. He had poured every penny of his savings into making it a home, and for the first few weeks, it seemed like he had finally found his sanctuary. The neighbors had welcomed him with warm smiles and handshakes. Bob Carter, a Vietnam veteran from across the street, helped him unpack his boxes, cracking jokes about how, once a soldier, always a soldier. Families brought over welcome baskets, and even Maggie Calloway, the HOA president, had shown up with a bottle of wine, flashing a perfectly rehearsed smile. During the July 4th community barbecue, she even raised a toast to him, calling him our neighborhood hero. It was an act so polished, so effortless, that Dan had no reason to doubt her sincerity. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. It started with a single letter in his mailbox, typed in bold, impersonal font. Some residents have expressed concerns about late-night mechanical noises disturbing the peace. We ask that you respect community standards to ensure everyone's comfort. Dan read it twice, trying to understand what it meant. He lived alone. He didn't own any loud machinery. Then it hit him, his prosthetic leg. The quiet clicks of the joint when he walked at night, the subtle shift of weight against the hardwood floor. He clenched the letter, a slow burn of disbelief creeping into his chest. Was this really about him? About his disability? Wanting to be a good neighbor, he didn't fight it. Instead, he spent over $2,000 of his own money installing thick carpeting, rubber dampeners, and even buying expensive padded slippers designed for prosthetic users. 2 days after he finished the modifications, there was a sharp knock at his door. He opened it to see Maggie Calloway standing on his porch, smiling that same smile, but this time, it didn't quite reach her eyes. Dan had encountered enemies before, but at least on the battlefield, you knew where the threats were coming from. Here, in Whispering Pines, the attacks were subtle, wrapped in polite words and fake smiles. Maggie Calloway stepped forward, peering past him into his home as if she had the right. "I've been hearing concerns from some of the neighbors," she said, her voice sugar-coated but her eyes sharp. "Noise issues." Dan gestured to the newly installed carpeting. "I've already taken steps to make sure I'm not disturbing anyone." Maggie tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's good to hear," she said, her gaze lingering just a little too long on his prosthetic. "Let's hope that resolves the issue." She turned to leave but paused at the last second. "By the way," she added, almost as an afterthought, "you are aware that any exterior modifications require HOA approval first, right? Even things like ramps or handrails. Just making sure you know." Dan stood there as she walked away, a cold weight settling in his chest. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. The way her eyes had flicked down to his leg, the deliberate pause, the unspoken message beneath the words. This wasn't about noise. This was personal, ***. A week later, the first official HOA letter arrived. Unlike the anonymous complaint, This one bore the Whispering Pines HOA letterhead and Maggie's signature. Dear Mr. Reynolds, despite previous warnings, complaints about nighttime disturbances persist. The board has scheduled an emergency meeting to address this ongoing issue. Attendance is required. The meeting is set for Thursday at 2 p.m. Dan read it twice, feeling his jaw tighten. He had his weekly physical therapy at that time. There was no way this was a coincidence. He called the HOA office, trying to reschedule, but was met with a clipped response, all meeting times are final. It's your responsibility to attend. Unable to change his appointment, Dan missed the meeting. The next day, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This time, it was a formal notice of violation. A new ordinance had been passed, prohibiting mechanical noises between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., with fines starting at $2.50 per violation. Dan stared at the paper, his hands curling into fists. They might as well have called it the Dan Reynolds Act. Bob Carter came over that evening, shaking his head as he handed Dan a copy of the HOA's latest regulations. There's not a single other person in this neighborhood this could apply to, he muttered. Then, lowering his voice, he pulled out his phone. But this is what really got me. He played a video recording from an HOA meeting, filmed from a distance. The quality was grainy, but the voices were clear. Maggie's voice. We need to address the property value issue before it spreads. Sometimes people just need incentives to realize they've chosen the wrong neighborhood. A slow chill spread through Dan's veins. This wasn't just about noise complaints. This was a campaign to push him out ***. And it was only getting started. The next week, a small security camera appeared on Maggie's house, positioned directly at Dan's front door and windows. Bob pointed at it as they stood in Dan's yard. She had it installed last week. Told me it was for neighborhood security. He let out a bitter laugh. Funny how it's only pointed at your place. The first fine arrived exactly 3 weeks after Dan moved in, a demand for $250, payable within 14 days. By the time the second fine arrived, this time $4,500, Dan knew he couldn't handle this alone. He reached out to a local attorney specializing in housing disputes, but the news wasn't good. HOAs have a lot of power, the lawyer explained. Courts don't like to interfere unless you can prove outright discrimination. And that's tricky. Dan clenched his jaw. What about the security camera? The fines? The targeted ordinance? The attorney exhaled. It's disturbing, but legally ambiguous. You need solid proof of discrimination. Document everything. The harassment escalated. Maggie's silver SUV started appearing outside Dan's house at odd hours. She'd sit there, clipboard in hand, making notes every time he left. At the grocery store, he overheard her telling another neighbor that property values drop when accessibility becomes too common. Dan took every step he could to comply. He stopped walking inside the house late at night. He even moved a portable toilet into his garage so he wouldn't have to walk to the bathroom. But it wasn't enough. One evening, after another $1,000 fine arrived, the Martinez family from 2 doors down knocked on his door. Mrs. Martinez hesitated before speaking. "We heard what's happening," she said quietly. "It's not right." Her husband nodded. "Linda, sorry, Maggie, she's been targeting others too." The Chens had to move after their autistic son was repeatedly fined for disruptive behavior. Dan's pulse kicked up. He wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, 2 more families reached out, sharing stories of harassment. One neighbor even showed him pictures of Maggie following them in her car after they installed a wheelchair ramp for an aging parent. Dan had spent his entire life fighting for others, protecting his fellow soldiers from threats overseas. Now, he realized he wasn't just fighting for himself. This was bigger than him. And he wasn't about to back down. Dan had spent years learning how to assess threats. In Afghanistan, survival depended on understanding the enemy, reading between the lines, spotting patterns before they turned deadly. And now, he was seeing the same patterns here. Maggie Calloway wasn't just a nosy HOA president drunk on power. She was executing a calculated campaign to make his life unbearable. And worse, he wasn't the only one she had done this to. The stories from the other neighbors weighed on him. The Chens, whose autistic son had been fined until they were forced to move. The Ramirezes, who had installed a wheelchair ramp for their aging mother, only to receive threats of architectural violations. The more he dug, the more evidence he found that Maggie had spent years weeding out anyone she considered undesirable. And then there was the fake petition. It started with whispers at the community pool. A couple of residents stopped making eye contact with him. One morning, as Dan was collecting his mail, he overheard two neighbors talking in hushed tones. "I heard they're already drafting a removal request," one of them muttered. Dan's stomach dropped. That night, Bob Carter confirmed his worst fear. "She's circulating a petition," Bob said grimly. "Claiming it's about protecting community integrity. She's been telling folks it's just a formality to enforce rules, but she's actually using it to propose a vote to have you removed from the neighborhood." Dan felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just about fines or surveillance anymore. Maggie was trying to make him homeless. He needed proof. He needed leverage. Bob's son, Jake, a sharp-eyed 17-year-old who spent more time online than in the real world, dug through Maggie's past social media posts. What he found was damning. Dan scrolled through the old screenshots, his stomach twisting as he read. Maggie had actively campaigned against disabled veterans in the past. 3 years ago, she had ranted online after her husband lost a local election to a Marine veteran. Another entitled veteran who thinks his service gives him special privileges. Next thing you know, we'll have wheelchair ramps on every street corner ruining property values. Dan stared at the screen. It wasn't just bias. It wasn't just discrimination. This was personal for her. By then, it was clear Maggie had a network of enablers, residents who didn't necessarily share her views but were willing to stay silent in exchange for favors. That explained why Emily Warner, the HOA treasurer, had suddenly backed out of helping him. It wasn't long before Bob found out why. Maggie funneled thousands of HOA dollars into her husband's consulting firm, Bob said, sliding a printed report across the table. Guess who just landed a city contract? That's why Emily shut up. Bribery. Corruption. A pattern of discrimination. It was all there. And still, it wasn't enough. That changed the night Dan's medical emergency almost killed him. It started as a dull ache in his leg, the kind he had learned to live with. But by evening, the pain had sharpened, radiating through his entire body. When he peeled back his prosthetic, his stump was swollen, the skin red and fever-hot. Infection. A bad one. Bob called 911. The ambulance was just minutes away. And then, Maggie Calloway personally denied them access. The gated entrance to Whispering Pines had an electronic system controlled by the HOA. When the EMTs arrived, the gate didn't open. The driver buzzed the call box, waiting for someone to let them in. And Maggie refused. "I was standing right there," Bob later told Dan. She walked over, crossed her arms, and said she couldn't authorize non-residents to enter without prior clearance. The EMTs were stuck outside for 5 full minutes while she argued with them. They had to call a neighbor to physically open the gate. 5 minutes. 5 minutes that could have cost Dan his life if the infection had spread. When the EMTs finally reached him, he was drenched in sweat, his skin burning with fever. The lead medic had been livid, threatening to file a report against the HOA, but Dan was too exhausted to respond. Lying in the hospital bed that night, he stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. Maggie had made one fatal mistake. She assumed he would retreat. She thought he would pack up and leave, just like the others. She had underestimated him. The next morning, Dan walked out of the hospital with a medical report documenting the effects of stress and harassment on his health. He sent it straight to Veterans Legal Aid Society, along with every piece of evidence he had gathered. And he wasn't done. Maggie had spent months trying to bury him under fines, fake ordinances, and legal loopholes. Now, it was his turn. Dan had spent most of his life following orders. In the army, discipline and patience were the difference between life and death. But this was a different kind of war. One fought not with weapons, but with strategy. And Maggie Calloway had just given him every reason to fight back. As soon as he was discharged from the hospital, he dove headfirst into assembling his counterattack. Veterans Legal Aid Society had already flagged his case as a potential Fair Housing Act violation, but Dan needed more than legal complaints. He needed to take away Maggie's power at its source. Bob and Jake had already been digging, but now Dan gave them a clear objective: find every piece of dirt on Maggie Calloway and the Whispering Pines HOA. They didn't disappoint. Jake sat across from Dan at Bob's kitchen table, his laptop open, scrolling through archived posts and records. "She's been pulling this crap for years," he muttered, shaking his head. "Every HOA she's run has had some kind of major turnover. People just leave." Dan leaned forward. "Why?" "Because she forces them out." Jake clicked on a link. "Check this. 3 years ago, a retired couple in another neighborhood filed a complaint against her. They installed a stairlift for the husband, who had Parkinson's. She started fining them for unauthorized modifications." Bob whistled lowly. "Jesus." Jake wasn't done. 2 years ago, a single mother with a son in a wheelchair tried to fight back when Maggie rejected their accessibility ramp. She got hit with so many violations she had to sell her house. He looked up at Dan. "It's a pattern. She's been doing this for years." Dan exhaled slowly. It was worse than he thought. Maggie wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president, she was systematically targeting disabled residents and pushing them out of their own homes. That night, Dan reached out to every single person who had been forced out of Whispering Pines or any of Maggie's previous neighborhoods. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. Others, like the Chens and the Ramirezes, were more than willing to help. And then came the real bombshell. An anonymous letter arrived in Dan's mailbox. No return address, no signature. Just a plain envelope with one line scrawled in black ink. "Check the HOA's financials. The money isn't where it should be." Dan took it straight to Bob, who made some calls. What they uncovered changed everything. Maggie Calloway had been embezzling funds from the HOA for years. Thousands of dollars in maintenance fees had been funneled into private accounts. Even worse, she had forged signatures on board meeting documents to pass rules that had never been officially voted on, including the nighttime noise ordinance she had used against Dan. This was it. The weapon Dan needed. The following day, he met with Rebecca Lawson, a journalist from the County Chronicle. She had already been investigating discrimination cases in local HOAs and was eager to dig deeper. When Dan laid out the evidence, the harassment, the fraudulent fines, the illegal surveillance, the financial corruption, her eyes widened. "This isn't just a bad HOA president," Rebecca murmured. "This is systemic abuse." Dan nodded. "And I'm ready to expose it." But he wasn't done yet. He needed a final, undeniable blow. The next step came from Sarah Warner, the wife of the HOA treasurer. She had been too afraid to speak out before, but when she heard about the fraud, she called Dan in secret. "My husband won't say anything, but I will," she whispered over the phone. Maggie's been diverting HOA funds to install those security cameras. Not for neighborhood safety, for targeting people. Your house wasn't the only one she was watching. Dan's stomach twisted. Who else? Sarah hesitated, then sighed. Anyone she considered a problem. Families with disabled relatives. Immigrants. Single parents. She called them liabilities. Dan clenched his jaw. Maggie had been running her own personal regime, deciding who was and wasn't worthy of living in Whispering Pines. It was time to end her reign for good. That night, Dan gathered his allies, Bob, Jake, Rebecca, the families who had been targeted, and the veterans' legal team. They mapped out their plan. The goal wasn't just to remove Maggie, it was to make sure she could never do this to anyone again. Dan sat at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people who had been hurt, displaced, and silenced. No more. This isn't just my fight, he said firmly. It's all of ours. We don't just want her out. We need to make sure people like her can never do this again. Bob nodded. So what's the plan, soldier? Dan exhaled. We take her down at her own game. The HOA meeting was packed. Not with the usual handful of bored homeowners, but with a room full of veterans, displaced families, and local news crews who had caught wind of the unfolding scandal. Maggie Calloway walked in, head held high, her usual air of superiority intact. But the moment she saw Dan sitting at the front, flanked by Bob, Rebecca from the County Chronicle, and an attorney from Veterans Legal Aid, her confidence wavered. She tried to call the meeting to order, but Bob stood up first, holding a thick folder of evidence. Before we get started, I'd like to bring up a few discrepancies in HOA funds. Dan followed, his voice calm but firm. We've uncovered financial records showing thousands of dollars in HOA fees being funneled into unauthorized accounts. We've also obtained witness statements and recordings proving targeted harassment and discrimination against disabled residents. He let that sink in before adding, and we have proof that Maggie Calloway illegally enforced ordinances that were never properly approved. The room erupted into whispers as Maggie turned pale. She started to protest, but before she could, Councilman Bill Lawson, himself a retired Marine, rolled forward in his wheelchair. I believe this falls under my jurisdiction, he said, pulling out an official envelope. The Attorney General's office has been notified, and an investigation into fair housing violations and fraud is already underway. Then came the final blow. Bob played the secret HOA recording, Maggie's own voice sneering, "I don't want cripples in my neighborhood. If the fines don't drive him out, we'll find another way." The gasp that followed was deafening. Even Maggie's staunchest supporters recoiled. One board member immediately called for an emergency vote to remove her as HOA president. The vote was unanimous. Maggie had lost. Her last words before storming out were a final attempt to cling to power, "You'll regret this. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without me." But she was wrong. Within weeks, Maggie's house went up for sale. An independent audit revealed years of financial misconduct, and the state filed charges for fraud and housing discrimination. Whispering Pines reversed all of Maggie's unjust fines, and the HOA board, under Bob's leadership, implemented new protections for disabled residents. Dan received a formal apology from the community, along with a refund for every dollar he had been forced to spend. But he didn't stop there. Using his settlement money, he launched the Thompson Veterans Housing Foundation, dedicated to helping military families fight back against predatory HOAs. On Veterans Day, the neighborhood held a special ceremony honoring Dan's service, not just overseas, but here at home. Standing before his neighbors, he looked out over the crowd, taking in the faces of the people who had once been too afraid to speak up but were now standing together. "Some battles are fought in war zones," he said, his voice steady. "Others are fought in our own backyards. Both are worth fighting. And both are worth winning. The crowd erupted into applause. Bob clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Hell of a fight, soldier." Dan just smiled. He had survived war. He had survived Maggie. And he had won. But the real question is, how many others are still fighting their own battles against corrupt HOAs? Have you ever felt powerless against an unfair rule or a Karen in charge? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.